They crawl, they stalk, and they don't typically like wearing anything. I'm not talking about your creepy neighbor. I'm talking about crawlers, strange creatures humanoid in shape, but they crawl throughout the woods, abandoned places, and sometimes a little too close to home. Enjoy these allegedly true sightings of crawlers. When I was a kid, my dad worked as a golf course superintendent in a small town in southern Illinois. This was in the early 90s, and the golf course's sprinkler system was not computerized like most systems are today. So on warm nights when the grass needed extra water, my dad would have to go back to work, drive his golf cart out on the dark golf course, and manually turn every sprinkler on himself. I always begged to go with him. In mid-September night after supper, he finally said yes. The night was warm as we roared out of the maintenance shop into the darkness and down the old gravel cart path. The golf cart had no headlights, so my dad had to steer based on his memory and the little we could see from the sliver of moon left in the sky. This was a small-town golf course and located a bit of a ways outside of town, so instead of being surrounded by houses like most golf courses are today, it was bordered only by cornfields on one side and a forest on the other. My dad told me he would often hear coyotes yipping and howling at night, and that they would sometimes follow his golf cart in a large silent pack, eyes glowing gold in the small flashlight beam. Knowing this, I was a bit scared when we stopped at the first sprinkler control box. He left me in the cart to go turn it on. I huddled close to my seat back and looked all around me, trying to see any coyotes that might be stalking us. Sitting there in the dark, I suddenly remembered my dad telling me the story of finding a man who had ended himself in the bathroom on the 9th hole. He'd found the man lying there on the cement floor in a pool of blood, his handgun lying by his side. The 9th hole wasn't that far away from where we were parked, and suddenly I was more afraid of ghosts than coyotes. It was after the 3rd sprinkler when they all started howling at once, so loud that it sounded like they were right in front of us. We were bouncing down a steep, uneven curve in the gravel path next to the deep woods, and my dad actually stopped the cart to listen to them. He sat quietly as the coyotes howled, and I begged him to turn around and go back. He told me to be quiet and wait. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see their dark forms. My dad turned on his flashlight and scanned the tall prairie grass next to the woods with its beam, but no coyotes were visible. Suddenly, a loud crashing sound echoed in the brush to our right, somewhere inside the woods. I grabbed my dad's arm, and he shrugged me off. He told me not to worry, but what we heard was just a deer that the coyotes must have been hunting. He told me jokingly that coyotes like the taste of deer way more than the taste of little kids, but I wasn't fooled. I could see the fear in his eyes. There was an old abandoned silo at the edge of the woods directly ahead of us. My dad used to jokingly call it Dracula's castle when he would take me and my other siblings out for daytime drives around the golf course. I remember thinking it was so funny, especially when he would let us throw rocks at it and try to get them to go through the grain-loading window at the top of the structure. They would hit with a loud crack and bounce off the silo every time. Then my dad would do Dracula's voice, shouting, "Stop waking me up, you naughty children," and we would all laugh. Now, coming to the turn where the silo would appear, I wasn't laughing at all. I was scared of that large cement structure, dark and empty in the night air that was getting colder by the minute. This story takes place in a Native American reservation in the summer of 2016. For a little background, it happened at my grandmother's land, in which she's surrounded in the mountains by forest. It takes about 30 minutes of traveling in the mountains of twists and turns to get to her house. The last 10 minutes is just driving down a road with forest on each side, and no light, since the moon would be covered by thick trees. We always had a set of rules, but we all obeyed her without needing rules. We could never go outside by ourselves. We were never allowed outside after sundown. We were not to look outside after the curtains came down. After all the paranormal stuff that happened there, I always made sure to follow these rules, and sometimes lay in the hallway that had no windows. I loved visiting my grandma's because I never really got to see her, except every few years, and I actually got to stay with her during the summer. After that summer, I never saw the world the same, and I began to believe all the scary stories told to me might be true. That summer, it was my cousin Carlos who was the oldest of all of us, my sister Judith, who was the second oldest, and lastly the trio, each of us a year apart, being my two cousins, Felix and Brett, and me, the youngest. One night, we were coming back from town, which was 2 hours away. My grandma was driving since we picked up Carlos from a party. He was in the passenger seat. My two cousins and I were in the back. As we traveled, it was a dark night, and Carlos kept insisting on going to his friend's house while he offered to get a ride home, or would simply walk back. My grandma told him no in our native language and started to lecture him like she would to any of us. You know the stuff out there, so why put yourself in the situation of seeing something? She sighed while she parked and told us to get inside. I was the most scared of all of us, and after the things I've seen and experienced, I just never looked around and never understood why it never bothered anyone else. I always shut my eyes and counted the steps until I reached her porch, and I finally opened them just to take the 3 steps up and open the door. Sometimes my cousins would help me, knowing that I would just shut my eyes during the night. Finally coming home to the wood crackling, the faint smell of cedar burning, and the warmth engulfing me like it was giving me a hug, this was my safe space. Being inside and having my grandma next to me, it always made me think nothing bad could happen. As all of us traveled inside one by one, Judith came out of the back room of the trailer. She didn't want to come with us to get our cousin, so she offered to stay home and keep the fire going. My sister was the complete opposite of me. While I was the scared one, she was always leading us on some adventure and never showed she was scared. My grandma favored her a bit more because she was more fearless. As my grandma says, they can sense your fear, so you never should have fear. Act brave, indicating all of the bad things that lurked in the woods. We all ate and cleaned up while my grandma decided to go to sleep and told us to behave ourselves. As we sat there, debating what to do, we began telling stories about stuff that happened at my grandma's house. Stories that happened during the broad daylight versus something that happened during the night. Suddenly, Carlos comes into the room and stops once he realized my grandma was asleep, and he smirked. My friend Danny called me, said he was outside since he couldn't drive, and I didn't get dropped off, so he just walked over. We began to protest, but he quieted us all. "Carlos, are you coming?" A voice shouted outside of the trailer, and chills just ran down my body for seemingly no reason. He opened the door and walked out. We all began to wonder if we should follow them, since Carlos was still a bit drunk, and the woods always made us get lost sometimes. Brett and Felix offered to follow their brother, while my sister told me to go with them. What? Why me? I was baffled, and my heart began to race. "You know where they go, because you always go with them, and someone has to watch the house," she pointed out. As she pushed my shoes close to me with her feet and gave me a jacket, my heart began to race. Brett and Felix took a flashlight, opening the door. I looked out into the dark. The little light bounced around as if it was dancing, showing where my older cousin was running off to. He was heading straight to the mountain that was shared with my grandma's neighbors, a simple barbed wire fence showing the property line. His friend was the neighbor's son that lived on the mountain. As we began walking, I shut my eyes, grabbing my cousin's sleeve as I started shaking. I didn't know if it was because it was cold or the fact my heart felt as if it was about to explode out of my chest. "Are you okay?" Felix asked as they stopped walking. I just shook my head and they sighed. "You'll be fine. You have us two here, and we have the rifle." They pointed out as I opened my eyes to see them on either side of me, holding out the rifle. We began walking again while they stood next to me. So I began to walk as my eyes stayed open. I looked around constantly, as if I was waiting for something to pop out and attack us. They began to talk about how much trouble their brother would be in, but they also feared that he would get hurt. As we began talking up the slope of the mountain, we began to hear the others laughing and joking around, which meant they were close, and I was happy, since the sooner we got them, the sooner we could go home. Come on, Carlos, we need to get you back. You know, Grandma hates us out here at night. Fred shouted as he helped me climb up the rocks as we began our slow journey up the mountain. The guys loved to hang out on the top because there's a small cave that went back a few feet, but not too far. They'd sit up there and talk, or sometimes occasionally shoot their paintball guns to see who had better aim. Just follow us up here. We want to see how the stars look and how much the light lights up the valley. Then we'll go back to the house. Carlos shouted as he and his friend waved their flashlights back and forth. The three of us sighed as we followed them, wondering how much longer it would be. It was already 11 at night, with the wind slightly picking up. The wind rustled the leaves around, making it seem like there was someone walking through the trees next to us. I figured it was my anxious self making up things to try and scare me more. Fred and Felix began to jog towards their brother, while I tried to keep pace. But soon I fell back a bit, and I began to walk. Tears started to fill my eyes as I was left in the dark walking fast. I could feel myself coughing, knowing I started to flare up. Just then I heard rustling in the trees, but I closed my eyes as my heart started racing. The same words my grandma tells us flooded my thoughts, and I opened my eyes and looked to my left. Just then I saw something pale run back into the woods. "Guys," I screamed as I began running, feeling my chest heat up. My face felt like it was burning. Tears made my vision go blurry before I knew it. I finally caught up with them, shaking and out of breath. I looked up to them and saw concern written all over their faces. "Are you okay? What happened?" Carlos asked as he sat me down on the ground. He made me put my head between my legs as they would do if I forgot my inhaler and needed help breathing. I saw something running into the woods when I was left behind. It was an all-force running back into the woods. I coughed out, taking deep breaths, shaking. I knew they would believe me, considering what we've seen before in our lives. "Did you guys see it too, or were you too busy leaving her?" I asked Carlos while lecturing his younger brothers, who in return argued that they thought I was behind them. The fact they were not running but jogging, they thought I could keep up. They never really hung out with me, but more my sister. So Carlos would keep an eye on me, and always had my second inhaler on him in case I forgot mine or couldn't get to mine. I remember the moon shining over everything, giving it a glow, making me feel at peace for a strange reason. I turned to my right, and I could see the trailer in the distance, with the lights on and the floodlights in the back on as well. Smoke trickled out, making me wish I was back, rather than on the mountain, dealing with some unknown creature. I kept thinking, skinwalker, as they are known around here. I never saw one myself, but I'd always heard stories about them and the dangers of talking about them. So I quickly got them out of my head, trying to think of what the creature could be besides that. "At least you guys brought the rifle," Carlos stated, as I turned around. He was holding it and looking at it. But, we forgot to bring more bullets," Felix chimed in and chuckled slightly. "Well, if we make it to my house, we can get one of the guns and more bullets." Danny spoke while looking behind me. I guess he was trying to look for the creature, or could be thinking of how far his house would be. "We just need to get out of here. Danny can carry her, and I'll follow everyone with the gun. We'll have to run when we're off the mountain, since it's a straight path." Carlos began helping me onto Danny's back, and I noticed the wind had stopped, but there were still leaves rustling next to us. I shut my eyes so that I couldn't look around. What is that?" Felix asked, as I felt Danny suddenly stop, and my heart began to race even more. We all knew we shouldn't deal with things that live in the dark, but we messed up, and now I felt like we were going to die. "Is that a—" Brett trailed off. Everything stayed silent as Danny readjusted his grip on me. "I don't know. It looks human, though," Carlos stated. "Why does it look like that?" Felix said. Just as I was about to open my eyes to look at what they were looking at, a single shot rang out. My ears rang too. I smelled smoke from the gun. I felt Danny begin to run, and I gripped onto his back as hard as I could. I opened my eyes to see Carlos running behind us, and then I saw it in the tree line. It was on all fours, the moon making its skin look like a glowing gray. We made it back to the house, and we woke up our grandma, who scolded us and started calling her brother, who was a medicine man, who would do a ceremony for us over the phone. I began to cry. I'd never felt so powerless. I'd never felt such an awful feeling thinking I was going to die. My grandma rubbed ash on our heads and told everyone to stay inside until morning, when we'd take Danny home. I always wanted to ask my grandma what the creature was, but she always told us to never question it or speak of these events again, that we were simply guests because it's their land and we're living on it. I never want to see that gray, humanoid, crawling thing again, and ever since that summer, I haven't gone back to visit. Back when I was in high school, my girlfriend, Anne, and I used to live really close to each other, about a 5-minute drive away, less if we sped. I don't feel comfortable giving too many details, but we were up to what all teens are up to when they hang out on the weekend and are cuddling under a blanket, watching a movie. We were in love and barely took our attention off of each other. That night wasn't any different up until that point. I want to say we were watching Pirates of the Caribbean, but honestly, I don't remember. That's just one of her favorite movie franchises, so I feel safe assuming we were watching it. I remember snogging, laughing, and cuddling as the night went on, until it was about my curfew, that being midnight. She was glued to my chest, begging me to pretend to have fallen asleep in hopes of her parents letting us sleep on the couch together when her family dog began to go nuts. Buffy, her dog, was a small thing, the kind of dog my grandpa would say is more rat than hound, but a good guard dog nonetheless. Buffy was yipping around the back glass door and snarling every so often. I stood up and walked over to the door to let her in when I caught movement from the back of their yard. For context, they have a garden running from the side to the back of their yard, so it was basically covered in greenery back there. But on this windless night, the leaves shook violently a couple of times when I slid the door open. I ushered in the dog and slid the door shut, locking it and pulling the blinds closed. I crouched down to pet Buffy and tell her she was a good girl. Suddenly Anne said, "Hey, Bo, unlock the door. My sister's still outside." "What? No, she's not," I replied. "I just saw her go to the tool shed," Anne retorted. "When I was younger, I was a lot more stubborn, and honestly kind of a jerk, so I pulled Anne to her feet and asked her to follow me out. With my phone flashlight on, we walked over to her family's shed, just so I could prove she was wrong. No one was there, just that creepy shed sitting alone in the alleyway between her parents' house and their neighbors. We walked back inside with Anne a bit upset at me, while I gloated at my victory. I kissed her on the forehead and told her it was time I go home before I got grounded for getting back too late. Like always, she protested more, saying, "Your dad never even enforces your curfew. Just stay a bit longer, please, lovey." But I insisted that I needed to be home on time. I slid my shoes on and started for the front door. Our hands interlocked, like the high school sweethearts we were, and still are. From her door, she walked me to my car, where we talked for a bit before saying our goodbyes. I started my engine once I saw she was inside, and at around the same time, I saw someone run past my headlights into the darkness. I shrugged it off as her neighborhood was filled to the brim with active walkers and joggers. Morning, noon, and night, someone was always going up and down those sidewalks. My phone rang, Anne being the one on the other end wanting to talk while I drove home, like we almost always did. It was dumb talking on the phone while driving, but we were kids, so we were invincible, obviously. So every time I drove home from her house, it'd be on the phone with her. I drove through her neighborhood and to the main road, both of us telling each other how much we loved each other the whole time. Until I got to the stop sign, a couple of cars passed, and I waited my turn to make a left-hand turn when I saw two strange human-like creatures crawling on the house across the road. I remember I exclaimed a few curses, which Anne was confused by. "You okay? You didn't crash? Did you?" "No, nothing like that. There's these weird things climbing on the roofs of some houses." "What do you mean, like burglars?" she asked. "I don't think so. They weren't wearing clothes, and they're extremely pale." "Weird. You gonna call the cops?" "Yeah, just give me a sec," I replied before hanging up, taking a moment to take everything in before calling. I called in an anonymous tip to the police and finally pulled out of the neighborhood. But instead of heading home, I drove across the street and to the neighborhood those things were in. They were crawling and hopping across buildings like no one's business, tripping motion detector lights and causing people to leave their homes to check out the commotion. I followed them for a bit before finding myself in a Culver's parking lot by the wash. I looked around, but I lost them after I pulled in, having to drive around a couple of buildings before reaching where they crawled to. I wanted to get out, but I was afraid to. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was Anne asking if I got home okay. When I told her what I was up to, she scolded me, telling me to stop playing vigilante and to go home. I agreed, not telling her I didn't think these were burglars, and began my journey home. The whole way back home, I felt as if someone was watching me. But nothing happened. I pulled into the driveway, shakily walking to my front door. This is the part where I feel like saying a crawler was waiting for me at my door would fit. But that's not what happened. Not that night. Instead, nothing was there. A week passed, and I mostly forgot about the whole incident, especially because I was usually freaked out when I got home late. So I assumed I was just paranoid as always, especially since I'm to this very day afraid of the dark. That assumption of paranoia continued until I ended up back in the same parking lot later that week to grab a bite to eat after staying late at a friend's house. I bought a few burgers and began to eat while sitting on the hood of my car, listening to the radio with the passenger door open. I was looking out at the wash when those same things crawled out of it and began lurking towards the neighborhoods again. I froze, just watching and taking in details. They were a light gray and nearly completely hairless, except for the strange line of what honestly looked like fur down the middle of their backs. They easily towered over me. I was 6'4", and these things were near the shingles of the houses they were climbing up. They looked thin, besides their stomachs, which bulged out, giving the illusion they were pregnant. Gods, I hope they weren't pregnant. I watched the three things run across the road and climb onto the roofs of buildings, and began climbing in the direction of the more residential part of town. At some point, I had hopped off my car and left my food on the hood. I walked to the sidewalk to watch from a safe distance. When I finally came back to my senses, I realized where I was and turned back around. I was bathed in the glow of the Culver's sign as its neon hum drilled into my head, the only sound I heard at the time. I looked over at my car and wondered when the radio had turned off and how. And to my horror, two more of those things were at my car, one at my hood, devouring my cheeseburgers, the other in my car digging around the front seats. I froze and watched as the things ate my food and ruined my car. My heart raced, but I didn't know what to do. I looked over to the restaurant, but the employees had been closing up when I bought my food, and by now they'd already left. It was just me and my car in the parking lot. I thought about running across the street, but I knew there were more of them there. I felt as if I was stuck between two horrible options in a horror film. My vision blurred and I felt sick to my stomach just watching those things eat. I don't know why, but I took a step forward and began to walk to my car. I didn't feel in complete control of my body, but I was able to steer it. I got myself over to the restaurant itself and now had a building between me and them. I leaned out and peeked over at my car for close to 20 minutes, watching those things scurry around my vehicle until they finally made their way across the street. That was when I really took notice of how they walked. If you've seen Harry Potter 3, it's similar to how the werewolf in that walked on all fours. Once I felt it was safe, I ran to my car, hopping into the passenger seat and slamming the door shut. I crawled over the console and took off the e-brake and sped out of there. My car was nearly out of gas before the wait, and now it was running on fumes. I ran 3 red lights to get to my trailer park in record time. My car sputtered out before I made it home, but I felt safe having passed the sign into my neighborhood. I pushed the car into my driveway, cursing up a storm as I wore myself out physically after seeing those things already took a mental toll. I pulled the brake back up and locked my car and went to head inside after I'd finally pushed it back into my parking space. I stepped through the stones of my front yard, quietly as to not wake my dad's dogs, and to the side yard my front door was located. I looked across the patio, and there on the wall separating my dad's yard and our back neighbor's yard was one of those things. Its back was turned to me, and a strange mass was held in its right hand. Quietly, I walked the rest of the way to my dad's door, and I was extra careful on the creaky steps. Despite a loud creak, the thing never turned away from its meal. I closed and locked the door, falling asleep in the living room that night. My bedroom was technically closer to that thing, so I refused to go into it. The next day, my dad found a dead cat in our yard and had the sad job of informing our family friend that lived nearby that their cat had been killed by a mountain lion. I haven't seen them since. I actually didn't live there much longer, only another half year before I moved out, and now I no longer live on that side of town. But to this day, I know they're still out there, in the heart of Tucson, living in the washes and storm drains, and they're the reason so many animals ended up on missing pet flyers. They're the reason I don't walk around town at night, and why I refuse to let my pets even go outside at night. Because I know that once the sun goes down in Tucson, those things crawl out of their holes and hunt our pets. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there, because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content, and we will see you in the next story.